Hey everyone, so in this video we want to talk about RBD forces. This topic is actually very simple because all you have to do is you apply the force that you learned in POPs. So all the POP forces can be used in RBD context because, as we talked about, internally in the bullet solver all your pieces are packed anyway. So it's really quite simple. What I have here, for example, is a grid and I scatter and align some boxes on it. If you actually look for forces, you can only find gravity. So there is no built-in forces setup. But for that we have the dive target. So in here you can add, and it actually explicitly explains that to you. You can use all the pop forces you know. So for example, a pop force, and you just stick it in, and then let's increase the amplitude. There we go, and we should see our boxes fly around. Theoretically, at least. Let's increase the amplitude. There you go, they weirdly move around. So this is actually, we could stop here because I think you understand this. You can add pop wind, pop force, pop axis force to move stuff around. But I decided, okay, that's a bit too boring. Let's actually look into something that's a bit more interesting where we could use that. And I came up with the idea of having kind of a car park, because who doesn't want to throw cars around? Now, before we have fun with this scene, let's actually talk about the setup. What I have here, of course, is a car that I downloaded from TurboSquid for free. And then I positioned it with a couple of transforms so I could manually position the cars. And currently, this is just a bunch of geometry. So I haven't packed anything. And I just wanted to show you what would happen if I do it that way. And before we move on, let's quickly have a look at the collisions. So we have some lanterns here and some stoppers, nothing too crazy. And this goes into our bullet solver, which of course has an activated ground plane. Now, if I would run this, all the cars, which are made of multiple pieces, of course, would just fall down piece by piece, which is interesting. But now we have this case where all the cars implode. So of course, we know how to solve this. I just wanted to make sure we're aware of it. It is interesting. Of course, it looks cool. But it's not really what we want. And also you can see it's pretty slow because it's so many pieces that have to be calculated. So instead of doing that, let's actually, and you can see where this is going. Kind of interesting, but not what we want. So just make sure, that's all I'm saying, that you pack the whole car yourself. Don't try to use an assemble here, because an assemble would result in the same problem, at least if you have the name attribute activated. So if you would just pack this, then he would find all the pieces automatically, and you could solve it by turning off the name attribute, but then you have basically the same as a pack. So both would work. Just be careful whatever you do here, that the car is one piece. That's all I'm trying to say. And then you can position them the way you want. And the cool thing is, now that they're packed, you will see the whole simulation will be much faster. By default, there will be less happening because they don't implode anymore. But at least, we have now a car as one, and everything works in a reasonable speed. Okay, so what can we do with those cars? Again, it's really straightforward. Let's just play around with the forces we already know. For example, a pop wind. So we start with a pop wind, and you can't see it again, but it's this direction here is X. So that add a little bit of wind velocity, maybe 2, and then add a lot of amplitude on the noise. And then I want to look at the whole thing from the outside, including my textured ground, because it's more interesting. And I added a lot of lights, of course, to make it more interesting. So let's pin this. It's already pinned. And now let's see what our wind does to those cars. And you can see, cool, something happens. Now, this is why I wanted to show you the whole thing in an actual scene, because we can talk now a bit more about how to, adjust those things to make more sense. Well, first of all, let's make it a bit stronger so that we actually see something. And especially with RBDs, what you can see, they kind of slide on the ground now. And this feels unnatural. And the reason is that currently there is no friction, and there's also bounce on the object. So even though it's cars now, all the things we've learned so far still apply. So if you go outside and check on the RBD bullet solver, you have here on the bullet object bounce and friction. Then you have collisions. Would be the stoppers and the lanterns. They have bounce and friction as well, and the ground on top has the same. So what I would recommend here as a beginning setup is decrease the bounce to 0 and the friction, let's say, to 2. I do this everywhere. Of course, that's kind of unrealistic, but it will just look better. Because when we run the whole thing now again, without changing the forces, what we will see is that the cars should now tip. And this is, of course, much more it feels more realistic, and they feel like they have a weight. And this is exactly what we're trying to achieve with this. Okay, this is fun. Let's quickly do a flipbook of this. So here you go, now with more real time, and you can see it's a lot of fun to see those cars fly around. They still feel a little bit too lightweight. I just wanted to show you what you can do. So that's pop wind. What else do we have? Back to the dive target, and let's disconnect this, and let's use a normal pop force so that we only have noise. So let's increase the amplitude to, I don't know, something around 7. Let's see what we get with this. And here you can see something is happening, but the kind of strength of the noise is not strong enough to create a lot of movement, even though that is quite interesting. So let's increase that further, maybe to 20, and see what happens. And here you can see now they really move around. And it looks a little bit like, you know, some kind of tornado or something. And this is, of course, something we will do next, but I just wanted to show you what interesting scenes you can create just by adding a little bit of forces, a little bit of the force that we already know. Okay, that's cool. Actually, for the next one, let me add something to the whole mix, because what I did is I added a bit of kind of dirt on the ground in form of little planes that I scattered, because then there's a bit more kind of dirt flying around with the cars, which is always a bit more interesting. Because in reality, of course, not only the cars would move, but all the dust and all the stuff on the ground would move with it, which is usually quite important. So what we want to add now is actually, instead of a pop force, a pop axis force. Because of course we do, because I love the pop axis force. And this is a perfect example of creating a little bit of a tornado effect. So first of all, let's make sure that our fall off is set to the outer strength of 1, so that outside of the sphere that we currently don't see, let me unpin this, there it is. So the size of the area usually would control the area where the force is happening, but the fall off outer strength set to 1 means, okay, it happens everywhere. So let's go back to where we were. So let's go back to our speed settings, and let's increase the orbit speed, a little bit of lift, and a little bit of suction speed, maybe not that much, and let's see what happens. Oh, that's a bit too strong, even though it's kind of cool. So be careful here. Yeah, it's still too strong, interesting enough. So let's lower this even further. So this is something you have to be careful with. If you increase the forces too much, then it feels unrealistic. Oops, that was nice. The reason for this was that the suction speed was, it's now negative. That was my mistake. So let's go back to positive. Yeah, this is better. You know, those cars are supposed to be really heavy. So be careful that you don't overcrank the forces. And now you can see a little bit the little pieces I talked about that fly around with it, which makes the whole scene a lot more interesting. Yeah, and here you can see what kind of chaos you can create. And of course, you can always merge this with other forces, like let's combine a bit of noise on top of the pop axis force, and then we can create some interesting kind of chaos. So now that we added those little pieces to it, let's actually for a second talk about mass. By default, the mass of all the pieces is calculated automatically. And we talked about this here in the bullet object under physical. There is a density setting, not a mass setting. And the reason for that is that it actually calculates the volume of the pieces and multiplies it with a density, which means that smaller pieces like those little paper thingies automatically have a lower mass than our cars. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, it depends how you see it, the mass is actually ignored by most forces. So for example, the pop axis force under bindings, no, sorry, in the behavior you find it, is actually ignoring the mass right now. So is the pop force and the pop wind as well. They all ignore mass because it's kind of easier and more predictable how the stuff behaves. It depends a little bit on your case, and again, you can always override mass and density. We talked about this, but just by itself, you could think about turning off ignore mass. So let's quickly look at what we have right now. And what you can kind of see is that the small pieces, and actually let me make this a bit clearer by just looking through it directly. The small pieces fly more or less the same as the cars, which might be fine for you. But let's have a look at what happens if I, at least for the pop axis force, turn off ignore mass. And you should see that the pieces are now moving much faster than the cars. So this is important to keep in mind. I'm not saying you always have to turn this off. I'm just saying it's worth being at least aware of this fact, that you might want to take the mass into account and that by default it's turned off. So here you can see the cars have a higher mass because of their volume, and the density automatically therefore calculates a higher mass. And by turning off ignore mass, they now behave different to those smaller paper pieces. And again, depending on what you want, this is the right or the wrong approach for you. So another thing I want to mention here is, of course, currently it's a bit boring that the cars, are just one static object. Later on, you will be able to, actually make sure that all the pieces break off and all that. It's a bit too early for that, but I just want to explain that this is not the end of what you can do with this kind of setup. But we will talk about fracturing and constraints later on, and then maybe you can come back to this scene to make it even more interesting by letting, wheels break off or whatever. But this, of course, is just a relatively simple approach to this. So I will make sure that you can use this file, so you can download it on the side to play around with it. But really, as you can see, there is not much to it. Play around with this, especially with the whole mass and friction thing. So yeah, for now, I hope this is a bit of fun. I hope this is helpful. Thanks very much and see you later. Cheers.